EMP explosive space modulator. I cannot find its primer. The centerfire rifle, pistol, and revolver ammunition primer and pocket specification by SAAMI. A very complete, totally non-biased collection of data for you and all your friends. For every kind of anything you want to look up. Whoop, there it is, right? Except the 209 shotgun primer isn't listed anywhere by any standard. Now, why would they do that? Is it a conspiracy? Let's point out a couple of things. Primers are supposed to be seated flush below the face of the cartridge case head. Recommended to 0.2 millimeter, apparently, or 0.008 of an inch. The cup may be rounded or flat. So is that based on the top of the thing or on the edge? We'll never know. Now, you can also just not do that and have it be a little bit protruding above. But something I noticed by accident, and I had to go look it up 3 times, and this ended up making it to where I could find out where the standards are for the 209 primer. Yeah, they're right in front of you. The 209 primer is named that, again by tradition and habit, based on a completely unrelated primer. The large pistol primer works out at 0.210 to 0.212 diameter. The others are 0.74 to 0.76 or 0.210 to 0.213. The large rifle primer and large pistol primer hover around 210 at their baseline. Okay, that's fine. So where did the 209 come from? Because originally large pistol primers specifically and large rifle primers were actually 0.209. The 209 designation for shotgun primer is based on the little tiny primer inside of the outer cup that it's in, because that's what was done. That was what they used. It's a 209 primer inside of a little holder. But why is it like that? And why do you find shotgun shells that don't have any particularly integrated anything in it and rely on that thing to do all the job of holding back the pressure of a shotgun going off? Well, let's look at this one. You'll see flash holes for all 3 types, for rifle and pistols, for both large and small. Okay, that makes sense, right? Because it creates a tiny hole, less pressure, back pressure, and these things can produce a bunch of pressure that pushes in and fires off things. It's less likely to pop out the primer of a bullet that's being fired. Okay, but you might have noticed something amiss here. The large pistol primer and the large rifle primers are different sizes because, well, they're used for different purposes. But the small pistol primer and rifle primer are both the same size, they're the same designation. Yes, that means at one time there really was a difference in all of these. There was at one time a large pistol primer and large rifle primer that were the same size, the 209. But anyway, they decided to use these standards instead. I guess. You be the judge. I can't find the history of it except to look up the literal history of primers for the umpteenth time. Now let's go off to the left here real quick. I want to point out something funny. The minimum size primer, the smallest small pistol primer, small sized, is 0.1745. And the hole that it can go in is 0.1745 as well, but that's for the smallest one. Yeah, no, that's the largest one. All of these are designed to fit into a hole that's a little too small for them. No jokes. Because it forces the metal to mechanically be crimped in. It allows you to make a replaceable and disposable primer go into it. And then when you get that out, again, I'm going to list this later, but I'm going to repeat myself here. Once you remove this primer, if you want to reload these bullets, these are used primarily for pistols and rifles and shotguns. No, just for pistols and rifles. You have to clean out this pocket and the hole, clean it, because you won't be able to jam this back in. And again, if you get the wrong size, it won't fit anymore. These are designed to be disposable, but they weren't really. And if you know the ratios to use, you find out that all of them are just slightly larger than they're supposed to be. If you get one that fits exactly, it'll pop out. It needs to have some abrasive behavior to it. In fact, a lot of them are glued in to make sure this isn't a problem. Same thing with the larger pistol and rifle primers. Again, the largest hole is exactly the same size as the smallest primer. What that tells you is that all of them have to be a little bit larger than what they're supposed to go into, or they won't really work correctly. At least that's what little I can get out of it. And yes, this is a single pager from Saami. I'm including all of the other links I got the data from, but it's important to know that. And yes, we're going to go on where I'm going to talk for a second here. Now we're going to the history of primers again. This is the umpteenth time. 20 milligram of priming compound in small rifle and small pistol primers. 36 for larger rifle, magnum, and 209 primers. Those are for shotguns. Now, the primer for a 209 is a two-part, quote-unquote, shotgun primer. It's an external battery cup supporting an anvil in a primer cup or cap originally for a ball, spherical, or powder, gunpowder, that was harder to ignite than flake or extruded powders. And what is it? What? Stop for a second. The little external battery cup is basically an imitation of the ass end of a .22 caliber bullet, or the shell itself. It's a little extra cup so that when you remove that primer from a 12-gauge shotgun shell or whatever, you don't have to clean it. You just put another one in. It replaces all the parts that has to be cleaned, and it includes a little tiny throwaway metal version of the primer cup that would originally be for that other type. So let's learn about the history of these things. And this is not a deep dive, but here we go. We're only going back to 1800. Edward Charles Howard discovered corrosive fulminate primary explosives. These are high explosives. You don't want to use them for actually driving a bullet, but they could initiate it from a very sensitive amount. So if you use the tiniest amount you could, it would always set it off, at least at the time. 1807, a Scottish reverend, Scotland, created something he called the scent bottle fulminate ignition system patent, aka he created the primer holder and made it to where he could fire his gun without scaring birds by having a flashover, because this was back in the days when you would use flint, steel, and, a musket. 1814, Joseph Manton created a copper tube containing fulminate primer, and it worked mostly. This was then just shoved into where you would normally have a touch hole and just hit it really hard with a hammer. It wasn't very practical. 1820, an actual percussion cap was introduced. This was literally the cap gun cap you're all used to seeing. It's almost the same diameter. 1822, Joshua Shaw created a fulminate copper cup percussion cap. 1828, Casimir, I can't pronounce it, developed the first pinfire cartridge. He put a pinfire cap inside of a shotgun shell, or a rifle shell or whatever, and used a metal pin going in through the side, and this was in use till 1910 by many people. All of these methods up to this point relied on the cap being initiated, or the ignition being initiated, at a 90-degree angle to the angle that the bullet came out, aka it wasn't done in line, it was done off-center. So, instead of center fire, these were offset. Next, Hiram Burden, a U.S. military officer and engineer, developed a primer cap, again, pressed into and over an anvil in a pocket in the rear of the case of a bullet. And that was how he did it. This design worked really well, but in the same year, Colonel Edward Molnir, Boxer of the Royal Arsenal in England, developed an integrated anvil version of the same cap that was easier to install. I'll explain. His design required that you drill a pilot hole into the back of the shell, then drill a bigger hole around it but not go as deep, and then just put the dang thing in. The previous version that had to have an integrated pin required that you drill it out with the larger thing, drill out two little small holes in the side, and then grind around that. It was much more complicated, but it made a much more complicated primer. Next, 1873, a New York dentist named Edward Maynard created many things, including the tape-based cap gun caps that you're familiar with. But instead of the red and white tape you're used to, it had brass or copper sheet and paper, and it was used to set off, basically at a 90-degree angle, guns. He decided to punch a small hole in the center of a brass disc, solder it to a drawn brass tube, not cup, and used a regular percussion cap on the back of it, stuck on top of a hollow tube, just like all of the guns were doing at the time, as an ignition device. It's called a nipple, by the way. In 1874, he decided to put a Berdan-type primer over an integral flash hole, an anvil, and primer nipple, hollow tube riveted into a heavy, turned brass head that was soldered to the drawn brass cup. Now, why would he do all that? It was to do the same thing I was just mentioning before, but he did it for shotguns. And he chose to use a specific diameter shotgun shell for the design, and he chose to use a specific type of cap. 1875, many cartridge manufacturers began producing machine-drawn one-piece brass tubes and heads. Full brass shot shells existed, designed to be reloaded indefinitely. Because up to that point, it was a fidgety thing to do, and you ended up having disposable items only. This made it cheaper. 1877, paper shotgun shells with primer pockets were introduced, using just the ass end of the aforementioned brass piece and just using paper. It made them lighter and cheaper in some ways. By 1880, many switched to the integrated anvil boxer type primer so that they didn't have to do all that complicated dreaming and drilling. They could drill one pinhole and then for fire hole, and then drill a larger hole to hold the primer, any size you like. And now you look up the metric and the inch standards and find out what happened? Yeah, that's what happened. They were still using pistol and rifle primers for full shot shells. As smokeless powder became available from French chemists, this increased pressure levels and required that they do a little bit better precision. It also had problems with needing to clean it before being gone, mostly. By 1900, a switch was made to small battery cup integrated anvil primer that was fit into an older primer cavity by drilling the whole damn thing out, and it projected into the shell itself, making repairing and replacing and refilling shotgun shells in 1900 an ideal year to 1920 because you could pop out the primer and all the corrosive crap that could be in it. By 1920, non-corrosive primer was in use only, it seemed, and it remained viable for decades because now they had created it. As soon as they created it, it eliminated the need to clean the primer pockets, so now you could go back to using any of these. You had choice. By 1930, gas seal cup wads that held onto the shot came out and held everything in place. By 1944, virtually all sporting ammunition in the United States used non-corrosive primers and non-corrosive or less corrosive smokeless powder. Polyethylene plastic shot shells came out in the 1950s. In 1955, U.S. military ammunition was loaded exclusively with non-corrosive primers and, in many cases, non-corrosive propellant.